any of this have to do with the stuff that we have been talking about? The Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Enlightenment, the stuff that you wrote for me on the exam? If there's one thing that came out of the French Revolution, it's this belief that people are born with natural rights, and they are equally entitled to their life, their liberty, and the enjoyment of their property, free from oppression. And as such, all people have the right to elect a government, to choose a government to protect their natural rights. This is liberalism, one of the things that we talked about a couple of classes ago. And from liberalism emerged feminism, which we did last 2 classes ago. This whole notion of, if we are now a society based on equality, then how can you justify having half the human race not have voting rights, economic rights, right to education, etc.? And so you had the women's rights movement that came out of liberalism. Equality in force for women. But the other thing that comes out of liberalism is a broader definition of equality. Workers and poor people, right from the very beginning, even in the French Revolution, and you saw this when we were talking about the French Revolution, right from the very beginning, in 1789, when all distinctions were abolished between nobles and clergy in the Third Estate, and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man said everybody is equally a citizen, everybody has the same rights and the same obligations, poor people came back with, what does it matter? What does it matter if I have freedom of speech, if I have no food? What does it matter if I can read whatever I want, if I'm starving in the process? And what does it matter that I have all these rights, but I'm not entitled to vote for the government in order to pass laws and to raise taxes to benefit poor people? What does it matter? All this equality. And so what you have developing very early on within liberalism is this discussion about you cannot separate political equality from economic inequality. The bourgeoisie are very comfortable talking about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, representative government, but they have money to put food on their table. Poor people say, and workers, thank you for all the rights, but I also need some help economically. I have a right to vote for my government. And if I could, I would authorize my government to fund public education, daycare, public transportation, workers' rights, union rights. That's what I want my government to do. That's where equality lies for me. Raise us all up economically, and then we can talk about freedom of speech, etc. What's going on? Before class. You have to go? All right, in the future, go before class. Yes, but get into the habit. And prop the door open. Now, this takes us to this. Today's talk. Okay. During this period, workers are having it worse and worse and worse. Because as industry spreads, workers become increasingly proletarianized. What does that mean? It means they lose all independence. They used to be skilled workers that had some control over how they did their job. But slowly but surely, as they're moved from the small shops into the big factories, as they're moved into the assembly line, it doesn't matter how skilled you are, because workers just do the same repetitive action on the assembly line. Does everybody know what an assembly line is? Who doesn't know? Emmanuel, do you not know? You know. All right. Well, in an assembly line, everybody has one small task which they're easily trained to do, and they do it over and over again. If you're easily trained to do a simple task, it also makes you easy to fire and retrain somebody else just in case you become troublesome at the workplace, right? It's harder to fire someone who's skilled and hire someone new. Now, in addition, and when you get increasingly proletarianized, you also get paid less because you're less skilled, you have less respect, you have less control over your daily work life, work hours become longer, working conditions become worse, and if you complain, you're chucked out. Skilled workers took it the worst because poor, unskilled workers from the countryside, when they moved to the city and they started working in the factories, for them it was a continuation of an incredibly hard working lifestyle. It was a different kind of bad working condition, but they were used to the long hours, poor pay, little respect. Didn't make it okay, but it didn't trigger a violent reaction like it did amongst artisans or skilled workers. These were people that in their lifetime, they were trained to be skilled, respected workers, shoemakers, tailors, carpenters, who would produce a unique product and get paid good money for it. But then all of a sudden the Industrial Revolution comes, and you don't need to pay a lot of money for a nice tailored suit. You can just buy the mass-produced stuff in the department store. And now these artisans, they're losing their specialized business. They're working in factories, they get paid less, they have no independence, and that loss of independence is what triggers anger, and in some cases, violence. Now, in 1848, across Europe, workers and some members of the middle classes or bourgeoisie rose up against absolute monarchies, lack of representative government, and exploitive economic conditions. The revolutions of 1848 failed. And this is why they failed. Because when the bourgeoisie and the workers unite to overthrow a system, once they're in power, their differences are going to emerge. And the differences are always the same: property. The workers are going to want from their government some type of economic help. The bourgeoisie want the government completely out of any economic relations. Low taxes, etc. So workers change their tactics. They go from being violent to moving into more sort of stable organizational patterns, like trade unionism. Don't overthrow the capitalist system, don't overthrow the government, but organize workers into unions, go on strike, shut down the industry, and force the employers to respect your right to work, your right to a decent wage, your right to decent working conditions. Problem is, trade unions are illegal. Remember, this is the era of the bourgeoisie, which believes in free trade. And unions are illegal. Why? Because unions are interfering with the business owner's freedom to do whatever he or she, well, he wants in their business. So unions are illegal, which means if you go on strike, the owner can legitimately call the police and call the army out to break up the strike as an illegal interference in a business activity. So then what happened? Things were so bad in industries throughout the world that unions kept developing and growing because it's the only option they had. And eventually governments got sick and tired of calling out the army and the police to violently crush peaceful labor demonstrations. So through the 19th century, trade unions were legalized in order to break this cycle of violence every time workers went on strike. And that was pretty good. And it helped improve wages and working conditions a lot. The other thing that happened in the 19th century was that slowly but surely workers got the vote. Because Britain, France, Germany, America especially, and then other industrial nations, the realization was workers are suffering under a capitalist system, and they are not going to keep it to themselves. They're forming trade unions, They're going on illegal strikes. They're interfering with the economy. And they are publicly protesting for the vote because they feel their government doesn't represent their interests. And at the end of the day, if the bourgeoisie are in power, at root, they believe in representative government, a government that represents the interests of the people. And workers are saying, but you've left out millions of us. And your government and your laws hurt us. So, in order to avoid more violent alternatives, governments slowly expanded the right to vote amongst workers, and they started voting for political parties that passed laws like the legalization of trade unions, unemployment insurance, public education, etc., etc., etc. Some parties developed totally on their own, brand new parties just for the workers, or social democratic parties. These were parties that took the ideas of communism and Karl Marx, but they didn't want to completely overthrow violently the capitalist system, at least not yet. They wanted to get into parliament, they wanted to play the voting game, get political power legally, and then change the capitalist system legally to make it less exploitive. And all nations developed social democratic parties. But all of this idea that the workers must be motivated, they must be mobilized, they must work together to improve their condition, all of it happens with Karl Marx. There he is, the granddaddy of Marxism or modern-day communism. Karl Marx is a genius because he took the basic ideas of Christianity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he brought it into the modern era. And he threw in some science as well. Some hard, critical thinking, looking at history and how the economy works. And this is where it gets interesting. First, and this basic Christian idea is, if you read through the New Testament, you see many instances of, for instance, Jesus Christ defending the poor against the powerful, against the wealthy. And it's that basic idea that society must be for the underprivileged, the underserved, which is not just in Christianity. It's also in Islam. It's also in Judaism. It's also in Buddhism. It's also in Hinduism. All those religions are based on the basic idea that the people, however defined, must be in some level cared for. So he took that basic understanding of Christianity, and he wasn't like a Christian, like a raving Christian or anything, but the point is, he took that basic understanding that the community interests must be paid attention to. And then he did that historical analysis that you read about in the Communist Manifesto. The idea that those that control power, wealth, control political power, and establish communities that benefit them and them only and exploit others. The bourgeoisie felt exploited under absolute monarchy. They rose up, rebelled, and they set up liberalism. But now the proletariat are the ones that are being exploited, and they must rise up like the bourgeoisie rose up against their exploiters. Let me see. We did all this in our discussion, so I'm just going to pass forward. Okay. Well, if Marxism is so incredibly enticing, and Marx predicted, capitalism is so horrific, it exploits so many people and makes them so miserable that workers they don't even have a choice. One day they will wake up and they will realize they have a common enemy and they have common allies against that enemy. And a revolutionary working class consciousness will develop. What's the problem? It didn't happen. The workers did not become naturally rebellious and revolutionary and violent. Capitalism did expand, but the workers' lives did not become worse and worse and worse. Why? Well, unions became legalized, and so working conditions became improved. Labor parties, the social democratic parties I mentioned, they became available to workers. So if you don't have to rebel, you can just vote for a different party that will pass laws for your benefit. Most people went that route. So what is Marxism's ultimate legacy? Marx instilled in suffering peoples, whether they were workers in the cities or peasants in the countryside that didn't own their own land, that as long as you recognize that you have something in common with the fellow sufferers around you, and that you have a common enemy, the only thing keeping you in your chains is your inability to rise up, or your fear, your unwillingness. Once you recognize you have that common enemy, there's nothing stopping you anymore, because you always have the numbers. That is Marxism's legacy. And you see this legacy play out in, where is it? The revolutionary revisionist split that happens in Europe at the end of the 19th century. Many nations, modern industrial nations like Germany, Italy, Britain, France, and Russia, all developed social democratic parties, which were parties specifically geared for the interests of the workers, and their voters were mostly workers at first. But the thing is, even though they take their influence from Karl Marx, defending the interests of the workers, they were not revolutionary. They wanted to work within the political system slowly and peacefully to improve the working lives of workers. But the problem is, these guys were reading Karl Marx, but there were other people reading Karl Marx saying, what about the revolution? What about the evils of capitalism? What about the need to violently destroy capitalism because it's always going to be bad? Those folks, the revolutionaries, who didn't want to just revise capitalism, they wanted to destroy it. They survived in all of these countries. And they formed revolutionary wings of their social democratic parties or socialist parties. And they don't go away. And the most important revolutionary wing of a social democratic party, the one that's going to be most important to you for the purposes of this class as well as world history, is the split that takes place. Do I have it here? Is a split that takes place in Russia. Vladimir Lenin, the head of the Bolshevik Party in Russia, believed that there is no negotiation with capitalism. You can't just improve it. You have to destroy it. Now, in Russia, not everyone believed as he did. There were those that believed there is a slow, gradual process to improve the working conditions of the peasants in the countryside, the workers in the city. We don't need bloody rebellion. Lenin, however, believed in Russia you will never have gradual change. We have an absolute monarchy. We have no real voting for the people. We have no civil rights. We have no free press. We have no means to slowly, gradually improve the system of life in Russia because we live under an autocratic, absolute ruler. And if you cannot reform society because you don't have freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, then your only option is violent revolution. And Lenin, this is what he preached in What Is to Be Done. Don't accommodate, destroy. Set up a new system, a communist system, where there is no private property. Everything is owned in common. The people have the power. Now, Lenin was kicking around Russia for years. Then he was forced into exile because he was always hunted by the political police, the spies. But he never went away. And after World War I, when Russia was in complete ruins economically and socially, his message that the way we're doing things is a failure resonated with people. And they were willing to give his revolutionary socialism or communism a chance. And thus you have the Russian Revolution of 1917, which fundamentally changes the 20th century and modern world history. He leads the first successful communist revolution in modern world history, followed thereafter by the Chinese, the Cubans, the Vietnamese, the Koreans, and a whole host of other communist parties that may not have taken power in their nations, but they certainly acquired leverage. And with that, I'll wind us up on time.